Let's get straight to the discussion right now. Joining us today is Julian Pendock from London. He's a partner at Stenhouse Capital. And with us throughout the entire 2 hours of Capital Connection here in Singapore is Jim Rogers, Chief Executive Officer of Rogers Holdings. Jim, thank you so much for coming on today. We want to take a bit of a step back here and kind of look back at that moment 1 year ago when markets around the world, investors around the world heard about Lehman Brothers going under, essentially. Where were you, do you remember, and what were your initial thoughts about this?
Well, I thought, thank goodness they're finally letting somebody collapse. I thought this was great. They finally gotten the message, and maybe they'll let the system clean itself out. I think, though, it was just Hank Paulson, because everybody kept saying, you bail out everybody, you bail out everybody, so he had to make an example. He only did it once. He should have let 10 people go bankrupt.
Jim, could you really let 10... I mean, you know, it was bad enough the week after Lehman collapsed, we had a run on the money market funds. If you'd let more than Lehman go, we would have had global financial collapse. Who would have that been good for?
Ross, I know that you have to have these people watching your TV shows, but there's 6 billion people in the world, which is a bigger world than just CNBC. Banks have been going bankrupt for a few hundred years. The world has not come to an end. And Ross, the way the system is supposed to work is when somebody fails, you let him fail. You let the assets, you let competent people take over the assets, reorganize the assets, and start over again. What we're doing now is we're taking the assets away from the competent people and giving them to the incompetent people and saying, now you can compete with the competent people with their money. This is just propping up the system. This is not going to solve the problem. You remember zombie banks from the 1990s in Japan? This is not going to solve our problems at all. We're going to carry it over and over and over and over again. You're going to be reporting on this for several more years.
Pendock is with us from Stenhouse Capital. Julian, does Jim have a point?
Actually, I disagree, because the problem is, if I agree with Jim that we're going down, we're going Japanese. The banks, we have got zombie banks. They're not marking to market. There's a whole host of issues to do with how their earnings have been largely fictitious, in my opinion. However, if you'd let more institutions go down, then systemic collapse, as the system was flooded with the liquidation, would have brought down the good banks with the bad banks. And I don't see how that helps. And I think the problem is there's an issue of moral hazard, and I'm sure that Jim would agree with this, versus the practical. The moral hazard, you let the reckless fail. The practical, you need to support the system, because yes, there are 6 billion people out there, and most of them are dependent on the financial system in one form or another to get access to credit.
So, your point is, if you'd let more, hang on, Jim, if you'd let another Lehman go, 2 or 3 Lehmans go, the whole system would have collapsed, and then the HSBC might have collapsed as well.
Well, absolutely, because the difference now than before is that the leverage ratios were simply astonishing. So before, in the sort of, if you like, the good old days when banks were boring and regulated utilities, as they should be, and hopefully will become again, then they weren't quite so interconnected and the levels of leverage were lower. This time round it was different.
Jim?
But Julian, you're talking about leverage. How can it possibly be that the solution to too much debt and too much consumption is more debt and more consumption? You're just re-leveraging the system 4, 5, 10 times more than it was before. How can that possibly be the solution to our problems?
What I'm saying is, if you'd let them all go down at once, then there wouldn't have been a system left to fix. I agree with you. It is crazy that in the West, the answer to having too much debt is borrowing more, and in China, the answer to having too much structural surplus capacity is building more. What I'm saying, though, is they're trying to, the patient on life support, and then try and sort it out. And what has to happen in terms of regulation, there has to be real regulation that really cuts things down to size, not just accounting rule changes. I don't disagree with you that much.
Julian, more regulation. We have regulation. There are lots of regulations. The regulators didn't know what they were doing. The regulators went to see Madoff 6 times in 12 years. What are you talking about? There are plenty of regulations. The regulators were incompetent. There's a guy running Fannie Mae whose name was Franklin Raines. I don't know why he's not in jail. He worked for the government. The government had at least 1,000 regulators looking after his company every single day, 8 hours a day. And they didn't see what was going on. What do you mean more regulation? What good is that going to do?
Well, for a start, you have the right regulation. I mean, a lot of the problems came from the government themselves. Fannie and Freddie were way too big. I mean, I agree now that they've been bailed out financially, and their market share has gone up from about 33% in first half 06 to 70% now. So there's a de facto nationalization of the US housing system, but there has to be proper regulation. Unfortunately, the Basel II agreement allowed and encouraged, perhaps, all this off-balance sheet stuff. That has to stop. The SIVs, the SPVs, securitization, banks being forced to lend to people who were more likely to be unable to pay it back. I agree. That regulation was disastrous. It was a nonsense. You have to go back to basics. And, you know, the systematic dismembering of the Glass-Steagall Act, one by one, all the checks and balances. It's like a movement from democracy to dictatorship. All the checks and balances were dismantled. So you have to have the right regulations. I mean, if you're proposing to have no regulations at all, then all the banks will blow themselves up again pretty quickly.
I'm not suggesting.
Jim, let me ask you a question.
I'm suggesting. Sure.
Jim, yeah, let me ask you a question. Over my right shoulder here is the old Lehman Brothers building, which I understand the Canary Wharf Group are still trying to get rid of at very reduced rates. Over my left shoulder, we've got Barclays. Has the risk really been deleveraged? Have people really taken their capital levels down, or have they just moved it from one side of the street to the other side of the street? Is the system the same, despite the fact that a couple of big names have gone?
Well, no, of course the system is the same. The debt hasn't disappeared. That's my point. If you liquidated the debt, then maybe the system would have changed. But now there's not. The same old debt is still there. It's in a different place, but now it's 4 or 5 or 6 times as big because the governments have all taken on even more debt. No, the debt's still out there. This hasn't solved the problem. It's made it worse. Ross, let me for a second go back to Julian. If I could for a second, let me go back to Julian. Julian, the countries in the world that have had this problem before have solved the problem by letting people liquidate. Scandinavia in the early 90s, everybody had a disaster for 3 years, but then they came out of it and they grew like crazy. Korea, Russia, Mexico, the Southeast Asia, this has happened over and over and over again. The countries get in trouble, clean out the debt, a lot of people go bankrupt, it's miserable for a while, but then they boom afterwards. Japan tried it your way. They propped everybody up, and now we have zombie banks and zombie companies.
Jim, first of all, it's not what I'm proposing. I'm saying we shouldn't go down the Japanese route. All I'm saying is we shouldn't have allowed all the banks to fail at once. Don't get me wrong. Secondly, I understand about working through crises. I lived and worked through Southeast Asia before, during, and after the crisis. And thirdly, so I'm actually far more on the same page as you than you think. I was going through Barclays' accounts the other day, going back to Steve's question. If you have a look at their balance sheet, they've deleveraged by 25%. Now, that's because there's £500 billion, and this is quite a lot of money, but not something you lose behind the sofa. £500 billion of the balance sheet has just disappeared through new IFRS regulations, which is something called derivatives close-up, which I call Barclays IR, and they say under those regulations you can net one item off against another. So, you know, that's my point about regulation. The problem is if they just introduce new rules, you can just start netting off sides of the balance sheet. You're right, we just have zombie banks. That's not liquidation, that's accounting rule changes. It's fiddling at the margin. So broadly, I'm in agreement with you, Jim.
Hallelujah.
Julian Pendock, partner of Stenhouse Capital, and Jim Rogers, thank you both. CEO Rogers Holdings, thank you both so much for joining us.